a lot of viewers asked us to invite for the first time Dr. Nicolai Petro, Professor of Comparative and International Politics and distinguished author. We've had the best of the military top brass in Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and now we have a very distinguished academic indeed. Dr. Petro, thanks for joining us. I don't know if you caught any of my interview with Colonel Macgregor, but if I summarize it, it would be this, that Ukraine army, Ukraine society, Ukraine government is now in a state of collapse, and no one can predict where all the pieces will fall. But what one can definitely say now is that the war is quite rapidly coming to an end, either by agreement or by military conquest. What's your take on those things?
Thank you for having me. I agree entirely with Colonel Macgregor's assessment on the military aspect. I would say indeed that the situation, I think in Ukraine now politically and increasingly militarily as well, I would describe it as catatonic rather than collapsing. It might be on the verge of collapsing, but right now there's a great deal of indecision and insecurity since President Zelensky lost one of his main architects of control in his chief of staff, and it's not even clear who will replace him yet. The budget has been passed this morning for 2026, but that was pretty much pro forma because the budget, it's a fiction. Roughly 45 billion of it, close to a quarter, is not even funded, and anticipates, as just to stay afloat, it anticipates getting some $45 billion from Europe to cover its current expenses. And that is in addition to the military expenditures, which we hear again, I think just over the last few days, we've heard the Germans say that the German Inspector General actually saying that they have lost contact with the Pentagon over military assistance to Ukraine. So a lot of channels that would support a continued war effort are being shut down. Although we can never say, just as in a body, if you begin to lose circulation, your prospects look dim, but we don't know when you will actually demise, when your demise will be.
The budget is, as you say, largely notional because it presupposes a 45 billion subvention from the European Union that the EU does not have, and it ignores the fact that there's a political crisis now right across mainland Europe, not really in Britain, where all the political parties on the top table support the government's line on Ukraine. But in countries where that is contested, as it is, for example, in Germany, the cracks are beginning to widen, aren't they? The head of the Employers' Federation described German industry as on the point of collapse. The opposition in France and in Italy, for example, where Meloni just postponed until next year any discussion on further assistance to Ukraine. So these organs are closing down, to continue your anatomical metaphor. These organs that have been supplying the blood are beginning to close down in Europe, aren't they?
Indeed. It's hard to see where the money would come from. And I think Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, recently remarked off the cuff that there is no plan B to America's financial support and military support. So But there is nevertheless a worrying, from my view, disconnect between the bombastic rhetoric of Europe in support of the war effort and of President Zelensky himself personally and his government, and the reality that no one is willing to actually fund this war. And without that funding, it's hard to see how the war could continue beyond the next few months.
How deeply is the anti-corruption probe cutting? One heard today, I haven't seen it confirmed, that the Anti-Corruption Bureau is preparing indictments on no less than 77 members of parliament, all of them in Zelensky's faction. It looks to me like Trump is performing a kind of controlled demolition of the current power in Kiev.
That's a good observation, and one that is widely shared in the Ukrainian media, which I tend to follow assiduously. So, indeed, many people, particularly in Ukraine, assume that the anti-corruption probes are one of the levers being used to push the Ukrainian government into a more accommodating negotiating position. The numbers could be much greater than we even suspect. I hesitate to give large numbers or figures because they could well be in the billions. Certainly the former prime minister under the Yanukovych government, Nikolai Azarov, has speculated that it could be as much as 100 billion. He's gone on the record with that. And that would, of course, have to involve pretty much everyone in the current government, up to and including President Zelensky. But
most people,
there is no confirmation
most people
of that,
believe,
except indirectly.
Go on, sir. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say that there's been a sort of indirect confirmation in that instantly the state prosecutor's office in Ukraine has found a way to condemn Prime Minister Azarov to 15 years in jail, even though he's out of the country. Well,
there've always been jokers in that regime in Kiev, but it's unlikely there is no Plan B in London. It seems likely to me that the current ambassador to London, I'm reading the Telegraph assiduously. It's easier for me than reading the Ukrainian press. The Telegraph appears to be preparing for His Excellency the Ambassador to become His Excellency the President. Do you think that that can fly?
It's possible, of course, but then I tend to agree with those who say anything is possible in Ukraine, but not very likely. This would be a direct slap in the face to the current administration. After all, Zelensky fired General Zaluzhny and then sent him off into the wilds of the United Kingdom, trying to keep him at a safe distance from having much impact on political events in Ukraine. To bring him back would be a very serious defeat. And also, I have to ask myself, what function would he serve? The only function, in addition to his military career, that he could serve is that of a candidate in a future presidential election. But that election, it wouldn't be possible to even schedule that election until a peace agreement was signed. And so far as I understand it, General Zaluzhny, Ambassador Zaluzhny, is not in favor of an actual negotiated settlement. So if he came back, it's very difficult to know what position he would take on the peace agreement that had just been signed. Would he accept it? Would he seek to reverse it? There's far too many uncertainties in his own position and how that position would play in a post-war Ukraine, which I would remind people, based on the polling data, is very diverse. In other words, some pollsters are convinced that after a war settlement, people would feel betrayed and therefore think of the military as heroes who need to be rewarded with maybe sinecures in politics, and that they would do well in post-war elections. Others, however, feel that there would be a backlash against the military, and that anyone who raised the prospect of a revenge against Russia or the Western allies that betrayed the Ukrainian military, that they would do poorly in a post-war election. So again, there's no clarity on how the military would do in a post-war election.
A banal question, but one to which I have no idea the answer. Who would vote in a post-war election? After all, there will be a good few million Ukrainian citizens who would by then be living in Russian-held territory. Would they be allowed to vote? In other words, the electorate which elected Zelensky will be a very different electorate to the one that's going to elect the post-war government, wouldn't it?
It would. But it's likely that the same policy would be applied in future elections that was applied even in 2019, which is that de facto Ukrainian citizens in the Russian Federation, of which there are probably 4 million or so, not to mention the occupied territories currently occupied by Russia, so that's another 4 to 6 million, including Crimea, they would simply not be allowed to vote. Whereas Ukrainians residing in the West would have an easier time voting. And this would certainly skewer the results in favor of the results that the current regime wants.
So finally, Doctor, with your great knowledge of these matters, is the likelihood, in your opinion, that there will be a peace agreement, or will the Russians just keep on advancing as far as they want to advance?
One will lead to the other. And that's clearly Russia's strategy. In other words, Russia will continue to push forward, expecting that this will lead to a more favorable political solution.
Yes, although the frontier will, of course, perhaps qualitatively change. For example, I made the point on Sunday that the missile attacks, drone attacks rather, on 2 Chinese-owned tankers that the Ukrainians first boasted of and then seemed to resile those boasts when they realized the import of them. That's a very powerful incentive for Russia to make sure that Ukraine has no access to the sea in future. Perhaps taking that logic all the way up to Transnistria. What's your take on that?
That would be a substantial expansion of Russia's stated goals, which have not changed from the beginning of the war. I'm not sure that cutting Ukraine's access off from the Black Sea would be an extremely punitive measure and would be difficult to accomplish because it would require, I think, a significant ramping up of resources. I think Russia could do it, but it would be a new phase and a new set of objectives in the war. The same outcome of securing Russia's tanker fleet and the security of the Black Sea region, as well as the border regions between Russia and Ukraine, could all be accomplished under the provisions of an actual peace treaty that was signed. After all, one of the major points among the 28 that are ostensibly part of the negotiations is a buffer zone between the two sides, and of course, specific limitations yet to be negotiated on the Ukrainian armed forces, both in manpower and in weaponry.